America 18-101-820, A Decade of Turmoil. Unity and Transformation, A Nation on Edge, 1810 to 1811. The decade opened with a rising tension that seemed to press down on every corner of the young United States. Barely a generation had passed since independence, yet the nation already felt the weight of forces far beyond its control. Across the Atlantic, Europe was engulfed in the Napoleonic Wars, a conflict so enormous that it reshaped the very map of the world. Though the United States tried to remain neutral, it soon became clear that neutrality offered no protection. America was being pulled into the gravitational field of empires. British warships prowled the Atlantic, stopping American vessels, boarding crews, and searching for men they claimed were deserters from the Royal Navy. Many of these seized sailors were American citizens, ripped from their ships and forced into British service. Every such moment sparked outrage, fueling a belief that the nation's sovereignty was being violated in broad daylight. American merchants complained that their ships were no longer safe, their goods no longer secure, and their rights no longer respected. The oceans that once symbolized endless opportunity now represented threat and humiliation. On the western frontier, the mood was no calmer. Settlers moved steadily into lands long inhabited by native nations. This expansion brought conflict, and conflict brought fear. Every new settlement felt like a test of how far the United States was willing to push and how fiercely. Native nations would resist. In the forests and river valleys of the Northwest Territory, tensions simmered like a fuse awaiting the spark. It was in this atmosphere that a new generation of political leaders rose to prominence in Washington. They were younger than the Founding Fathers, less cautious, and far more willing to challenge the great powers of the world. They came to be known as the War Hawks, with bold voices and fiery speeches. Men like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun argued that the United States must defend its honor, its freedom, and its right to grow. They believed that Britain was not simply interfering with American trade, but encouraging native resistance in the West harming tribes, supporting alliances and attempting to stop U.S. expansion before it became unstoppable. To these new leaders, inaction was not an option. The United States could not, they argued, allow another nation to dictate its destiny. They saw war not as a tragedy, but as a necessary step toward national assertiveness. To them, a young nation had to prove itself if it hoped to be respected. Many Americans, especially in the West and South, found their arguments persuasive. Patriotism surged, mixing with frustration, fear, and ambition. Meanwhile, far from the halls of Congress, a powerful native confederation was forming under the leadership of Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, the prophet. Their message was electrifying. Native nations must unite. Only together could they stand against the advance of American settlement. Their movement spread across tribal lines, inspiring hope among native peoples who had seen treaty after treaty chip away at their homelands. Tecumseh's vision was bold, almost unprecedented. He sought to create a broad alliance capable of halting the American tide. Many tribes joined him. Many more watched closely, waiting to see whether this rising movement could survive. To settlers in the frontier territories, Tecumseh's confederation stirred deep anxiety. Rumors of a vast native uprising circulated in taverns and frontier towns. Stories spread some true. Many imagined of British agents supplying weapons, encouraging resistance, and plotting with Tecumseh behind the scenes. Whether exaggerated or accurate, these fears fed directly into the War Hawks' message. Americans believed they were being challenged not only at sea by Britain, but on land by native resistance, creating a sense that the nation's future was under threat from every direction. Throughout 1810 and 1811, the sense of momentum built steadily. Diplomatic efforts faltered. Economic pressures mounted. The Embargo Act and later trade restrictions attempted to punish Britain and France, but instead harmed American merchants and sailors. Each attempt at peaceful pressure seemed to fail. making war appear less like a choice and more like an inevitability. In Congress, debates grew louder. Newspapers across the country took sides, some warning that war would devastate the fragile economy, others insisting that national dignity was at stake. By the autumn of 1811, the tension erupted into open conflict on the frontier. General William Henry Harrison led American forces toward Prophetstown, a settlement at the heart of Tecumseh's movement. Tecumseh was away, seeking alliances, but the Prophet's followers prepared for confrontation. When battle erupted along the Tippecanoe River, the fighting was fierce, chaotic, and decisive. Harrison's forces drove back the native confederation and destroyed their town. News of the battle spread quickly, and American newspapers declared victory. To many Americans, Tippecanoe became proof of what they had suspected all along, that Britain had encouraged native resistance and that only force could secure peace. The political impact of Tippecanoe was immediate. The warhawks surged in influence, arguing that the frontier fighting was only one piece of a much larger conflict. Support for war grew stronger in Congress, and President James Madison faced mounting pressure to take action. The nation felt caught in a tightening vice, humiliated at sea, threatened on land, and stirred by a fierce desire to assert its independence once and for all. People across the country sensed the shifting mood. Farmers, sailors, merchants, and politicians all understood that history was accelerating. Every headline, every debate, every rumor seemed to point in the same direction. The United States was moving towards something explosive, something that would define its future and test its strength. The young republic, still fragile, still learning, was standing on the edge of a decade that would challenge it like never before. As 1811 drew to a close, the atmosphere was unmistakable. The United States was a nation standing at the threshold of war, a nation questioning how much longer it could tolerate insults from abroad, a nation contemplating a conflict that could either secure its place in the world or expose its greatest weaknesses. In every port and every frontier settlement, in every household that listened to the news, Americans felt the same truth. The storm was coming, and there was no turning back. The rise of the warhawks, 1811 to 1812. As the United States stepped deeper into the second decade of the 1800s, the mood of the nation grew tense, impatient, and increasingly divided. The young republic found itself pressured from every direction. On the oceans, British naval forces continued stopping American merchant ships, capturing cargo, and impressing sailors. On the frontier, American settlers faced growing native resistance. The feeling was unmistakable. The United States was being challenged abroad, threatened at home, and pushed to decide what kind of nation it intended to become. Into this storm stepped a new generation of American leaders, young, fiery, and determined to push the country onto the world stage with newfound confidence. They came to be known as the Warhawks. These men were unlike the older politicians who had guided the country through the Revolution and the fragile early years of the Republic. The Warhawks were energetic nationalists who believed the United States needed to assert itself with strength and resolve. Among their most influential voices were Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Clay, charismatic and ambitious, carried himself as if destiny were already pulling him toward a central role in shaping America's future. Calhoun, sharp-minded and intense, spoke with conviction about honor, sovereignty, and national pride. Though young, they captured the imagination of the public, especially those living on the frontier, where fear and anger had been building for years. The Warhawks argued that Britain was not merely inconveniencing the United States, but actively undermining it. They believed the British armed native nations in the Northwest Territory, supplying weapons and encouraging resistance in an effort to contain American growth. Whether every accusation was accurate mattered less than the feeling rising across the frontier. Many Americans were convinced that their nation's destiny was being blocked by foreign interference, and they were eager for leaders who would act decisively. the Warhawks positioned themselves as those leaders. Meanwhile, far beyond the halls of Congress, a powerful native resistance movement was gaining momentum. Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa the Prophet, had built a broad confederation of tribes, united by a single purpose: stop the relentless advance of American settlement. Their message resonated deeply among indigenous nations who had watched treaty after treaty erode their lands, traditions, and stability. Tecumseh traveled hundreds of miles, urging unity, arguing that no single tribe had the authority to sell land shared by all, and declaring that native peoples must stand together or be swept aside by American expansion. His voice was strong, his presence commanding, and his vision unmatched. Tenskwatawa, with his spiritual influence, gave the movement a powerful sense of purpose. Together, the brothers created a force unlike anything the United States had seen in the region. For settlers living in the frontier territories, Tecumseh's growing confederation stirred deep unease. Rumors spread that the Confederation was preparing for a massive uprising. Stories often exaggerated claimed British agents were working alongside Tecumseh, supplying weapons and advising strategy. Even without full evidence, fear spread quickly, mixing with the frustration settlers already felt toward Britain's actions at sea. Every new rumor strengthened the Warhawks' argument that the United States was facing a coordinated challenge and that only strength could answer it. In this tense atmosphere, General William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory, took action. He viewed Tecumseh's movement as a direct threat to American expansion and believed the time to confront it had arrived. In late 1811, Tecumseh traveled south to seek alliances with the Cherokee, Choctaw, and other nations. Harrison saw the leader's absence as an opportunity. He marched a force of American soldiers toward Prophetstown, the heart of Tecumseh's movement. Tenskwatawa, confident that spiritual power would protect his followers, urged them to resist. What happened next would change the direction of the entire nation. On the morning of November 7, 1811, Harrison's forces clashed with Tenskwatawa's warriors along the Tippecanoe River. The fighting was chaotic, intense, and deadly. Although both sides suffered casualties, Harrison's men ultimately drove the native forces back and destroyed Prophetstown. The Battle of Tippecanoe became an instant symbol across the United States. Newspapers hailed it as a major victory, portraying the Native Confederation as a British-inspired threat that had been defeated through American courage and determination. Whether the reporting was fully accurate mattered little. The political impact was enormous. News of Tippecanoe ignited outrage among Americans who already believed Britain was provoking trouble on the frontier. The Warhawks seized the moment, arguing that the battle proved their warnings correct. They insisted that the United States must take a firm stand, not only to defend its people, but to assert its place in a world dominated by powerful empires. This was no longer merely a dispute over trade or maritime rights. The Warhawks painted the moment as a defining test of national character. Were Americans willing to defend their honor? Were they prepared to stand up to a global power? Were they ready to take control of their own destiny? Support for war surged. Young congressmen made impassioned speeches. Newspapers called for action. And ordinary citizens, especially those in the South and West, spoke openly about the need for decisive force. Although not everyone supported the rising drumbeat, the momentum was unmistakable. The Warhawks had reshaped the national conversation. They had turned frustration into determination and determination into political pressure. By the end of 1811 and the beginning of 1812, the United States stood closer to war than at any other time since the Revolution. President James Madison watched the situation intensify. Diplomatic options were shrinking. Economic measures had failed to curb British interference. The frontier was unstable. The Warhawks pressed him relentlessly, warning that delay would show weakness. Across the country, Americans felt a storm gathering, a sense that the nation was being pulled toward a moment that would define its future. The Warhawks had changed everything. They had taken a nation divided by fear and uncertainty and pushed it toward a single explosive conclusion. By mid-1812, the question was no longer whether the United States would fight, but when. The Warhawks had transformed national frustration into national willpower. They had pushed America to the edge of conflict. The rise of this young, fiery generation marked a turning point in American history, a moment when ambition, anger, pride, and fear combined to propel a young nation toward war, toward destiny, and toward a future no one could fully predict. The war begins 1812. In the summer of 1812, the United States crossed a line from which there was no turning back. After years of tension, frustration, and national humiliation, President James Madison signed the declaration of war against Great Britain. It was the first time the young republic had ever declared war on a foreign power. The announcement echoed across the nation, stirring pride, anger, fear, and uncertainty in equal measure. For some Americans, especially those living in the South and West, the decision felt overdue. For others, particularly in New England, it felt reckless and dangerous. The country had entered the War of 1812, and nothing about the conflict would unfold as expected. The division inside the United States was immediate and intense. Western settlers cheered the decision, believing that British influence had fueled native resistance on the frontier for far too long. Southerners hoped a victorious war would reaffirm America's honor and perhaps open new territory for expansion. But in New England, where merchants depended heavily on overseas trade, the reaction was furious. British blockades had already damaged commerce, and many feared that full-scale war would destroy the region's economy. To them, war risked everything the young country had worked so hard to build. Even as Congress voted for war, the nation was already debating what it meant to fight. Despite the bold announcement, the United States entered the conflict profoundly unprepared. The army was small, poorly trained, and scattered. Many officers were inexperienced, and some still clung to outdated tactics from the Revolutionary era. Supplies were inconsistent, logistics disorganized, and communication slow. Yet confidence in American ambition overshadowed these weaknesses. War supporters believed that victory would come quickly. They assumed the invasion of Canada, then under British control, would be easy. They expected frontier volunteers to sweep across the border and bring the fight northward with overwhelming force. But what awaited them was far from simple. The earliest American campaigns revealed just how unready the United States was for war. The attempt to invade Canada quickly descended into confusion. Poor planning, miscommunication, and divided leadership plagued nearly every effort. General William Hull's invasion into Upper Canada ended in retreat and surrender, a moment so embarrassing that Hull was later court-martialed. American troops struggled with discipline, morale, and inconsistent supplies. Battles that supporters believed would be straightforward victories turned into costly defeats or frustrating stalemates. Instead of sweeping triumphs, the early months produced disappointment, confusion, and rising doubt about the nation's ability to fight a global empire. Yet, even as the land campaigns faltered, the seas told a different story. The U.S. Navy, though small, proved to be far more capable than anyone expected. American shipbuilders had crafted vessels that were fast, durable, and heavily armed. Among them was the USS Constitution, a frigate that would become legendary. When it met British ships in open combat, the results astonished the world. The Constitution defeated HMS Guerriere in a stunning victory, earning the nickname Old Ironsides after enemy cannonballs seemed to bounce off its strong wooden hull. Other American ships achieved similar success, capturing or sinking powerful British vessels and boosting national morale when it was needed most. These naval victories carried enormous symbolic weight. The British Royal Navy was considered the mightiest naval force on Earth, feared and respected across the globe. To defeat even a single British warship was remarkable. To defeat several in quick succession sent shockwaves through Europe and electrified Americans who had grown weary of humiliation. Newspapers celebrated the sailors as national heroes. Their victories proved that the young republic was capable of standing against a giant. For the first time since independence, Americans found themselves cheering not only the idea of bravery, but undeniable proof of it. Still, naval victories alone could not overshadow the grim reality on land. As 1812 progressed, the United States faced harsh lessons about the challenges of war. British forces, working closely with native allies in the Northwest, repelled American assaults and seized forts with well-coordinated strikes. Native fighters, experienced in frontier warfare, used the terrain to their advantage. American soldiers, often poorly equipped and lacking proper training, struggled to match their opponent's skill and strategy. The war became a test of endurance and adaptation rather than a quick showcase of military power. Across the nation, emotions ran high. Families waited anxiously for news of loved ones serving on distant frontiers. Merchants worried about the growing British blockade closing off ports and strangling trade. Farmers questioned how long the conflict would drag on. Supporters of the war insisted that victory would restore national honor, while opponents warned that the United States was risking everything with no clear plan for success. The political rivalry surrounding the conflict only deepened divisions that were already shaping the future of the country. Yet, despite the setbacks, Americans found themselves bound together by an emerging sense of identity. Defeat did not break the nation instead. It produced a determination to prove itself worthy of independence. Newspapers began printing stories of bravery, resilience, and sacrifice. The public imagination shifted from the humiliation of early losses to the pride of naval victories. The idea of national honor, fragile but powerful, took root in every region of the country. The United States, still learning how to act as a unified nation, began to understand that wars were not only fought on battlefields, but in the minds of the people who endured them. By the end of 1812, the war had become a paradox. It was a conflict marked by disappointment on land and stunning triumph at sea. A war that exposed weaknesses, but also revealed strengths. A struggle that showed how fragile the United States still was, yet how determined it had become. The first year of the War of 1812 shaped the nation in ways few could have predicted. It demonstrated that America was not yet fully prepared to stand as a global power. Yet it proved that the nation possessed the courage and resolve necessary to survive the challenge. The war had only just begun, but already it had forged a new sense of identity. The United States was learning not only how to fight, but why it chose to fight. The defeats and victories of 1812 would set the stage for the dramatic years ahead, years in which the country would face fire, fear, triumph, and transformation. The conflict that some had believed would be short and simple was turning into something far more complex. And as winter settled over the nation, one truth became clear. The war would test the United States in ways no one had imagined, and the outcome would shape the future of the Republic for generations. Struggle for the Frontier 1812 to 1813, as the War of 1812 entered its second year. The center of gravity shifted toward the northwest frontier, a vast region of forests, lakes, and rivers where the fate of the young United States confronted one of its greatest challenges. Here, the conflict was not merely a struggle between two nations. It was a battle for survival, identity, and the future of an entire continent. American forces, British troops, and native confederacies collided in a campaign that was as personal as it was strategic, as emotional as it was violent. The Frontier War would reveal both the limits of American military power and the extraordinary resilience of the people, determined to shape the nation's destiny. From the very beginning, the frontier had been a place of tension. Settlers moving into the Northwest Territory carried hopes of land, opportunity, and new beginnings. But to the native nations who had lived there for generations, the expansion represented a threat to their survival. The death of Tecumseh's confederation at Tippecanoe in 1811 had not ended the struggle, far from it. Instead, it hardened the resolve of many native warriors and deepened their alliance with the British. They saw the United States not as a neighbor expanding its borders, but as a force driving them from their homelands. As the war intensified, this alliance became central to the British strategy. For the United States, controlling the frontier meant controlling the Great Lakes, a network of waterways that served as the lifelines of the region. Whoever commanded the lakes would command the supply routes, the forts, and the strategic movements essential to victory. But early in the war, British forces under General Isaac Brock and their native allies dominated the area. American attempts to seize control were hindered by disorganization, divided leadership, and deep logistical challenges. Communications were slow, supplies were inconsistent, and the distances enormous. The frontier exposed every vulnerability in the young nation's military structure. In the early months of the campaign, American morale suffered blow after blow. The fall of Detroit in 1812 was a painful humiliation. General William Hull's surrender of an entire American army without a significant fight stunned the nation. The event confirmed what many feared, that the United States was not yet prepared for the realities of frontier warfare. British forces, strengthened by Shawnee, Potawatomi, and other native fighters, held the upper hand. Their knowledge of the land, their mobility, and their unity under powerful leaders gave them a decisive advantage over American troops who were unfamiliar with the terrain and still trying to adapt to its challenges. But the American cause found renewed strength through determination, leadership, and an understanding that retreat was no longer an option. In early 1813, the United States made a series of decisive moves to reclaim control of the frontier. At the center of these efforts was Oliver Hazard Perry, a young naval commander tasked with building a fleet from scratch on the shores of Lake Erie. Working with limited resources in difficult conditions, Perry oversaw the construction of ships that would eventually challenge British dominance on the lake. His mission was daunting, but his resolve symbolized the new American spirit taking shape in the war's second year. Meanwhile, American ground forces under General William Henry Harrison reorganized and prepared for renewed operations. Harrison's strategy focused on retaking Detroit and breaking the British-Native alliance that had become the backbone of resistance in the region. But any plan depended on success at sea. Without control of Lake Erie, American troops could not move supplies, reinforce positions, or launch the offensive necessary to change the tide of the war. Everything depended on the fleet Perry was building. By the summer of 1813, Perry was ready. On September 10th, the Battle of Lake Erie erupted, one of the most dramatic naval engagements in American history. The fighting was fierce, brutal, and chaotic. Perry's flagship was heavily damaged, its decks strewn with splintered wood and smoke. But refusing to yield, Perry took the battle flag, famously crossed in a small boat to another vessel, and re-entered the fight. His determination turned the tide. The American fleet captured the entire British squadron. When the battle ended, Perry sent a message that echoed across the nation. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." The victory transformed the strategic landscape. With Lake Erie under American control, the British position in the Northwest began to collapse. Supplies became scarce, reinforcements were isolated, and native allies saw the balance of power shifting. Harrison seized the moment. His army advanced north, retook Detroit, and pushed deep into territory long controlled by British and native forces. The pursuit culminated in the Battle of the Thames on October 5, 1813. The battle was swift but decisive. American forces overwhelmed the British line, and in the fighting that followed, Tecumseh, one of the most influential native leaders in American history, was killed. His death shattered the confederation he had worked tirelessly to build. Although native warriors continued to fight bravely, the movement that had unified them lost its central figure, its vision, and its momentum. For the United States, the victory at the Thames marked a turning point. The frontier, once dominated by British and native resistance, was beginning to bend toward American control. Yet the triumph came with a profound sense of tragedy. The death of Tecumseh symbolized the end of a powerful indigenous resistance movement that had sought to preserve lands, culture, and sovereignty. His legacy would echo through history as both a visionary leader and a symbol of the cost of American expansion. By the end of 1813, the struggle for the frontier had changed the course of the war. The United States had gone from humiliation and retreat to decisive victories. The Great Lakes were now under American command. The British were forced into withdrawal. And the native confederation that had challenged American expansion for years had suffered a devastating blow. But the war was far from over. While the frontier campaign had shifted momentum in America's favor, new challenges awaited elsewhere in the South, on the Atlantic coast, and in the political heart of the nation. The struggle for the frontier revealed more than the movement of armies. It showed the determination of a young nation to defend its future, the resilience of native peoples who fought for their homeland, and the powerful forces of ambition, fear, and hope that shaped an entire generation. As 1813 closed, the United States had learned one of its most important lessons. Victory required not just courage, but strategy, unity, and an unshakable resolve to endure whatever storms lay ahead. The war expands south, 1813 to 1814, as the fighting raged across the northern frontier. Another conflict was erupting far to the south, one that would reshape the American Southeast, elevate new leaders to national fame, and alter the destiny of entire native nations. The War of 1812 was never a single struggle on a single battlefield. It was a series of intertwined conflicts stretching across a continent, and nowhere was this more evident than in the Deep South. Here, the United States found itself pulled into a brutal struggle known as the Creek War, a conflict that merged local tensions, cultural divisions, and the global pressures of the British-American rivalry into a single, devastating confrontation. For generations, the Creek Nation had been one of the most powerful indigenous groups in the Southeast. Its people were deeply rooted in the lands of present-day Alabama and Georgia, bound together by tradition, kinship, and a rich cultural heritage. But by the early 1800s, the Creeks were divided. A growing number of mixed heritage and trade-connected Creek leaders encouraged diplomacy and cooperation with the United States. They believed that peaceful coexistence, adaptation, diplomacy, and selective adoption of American customs for the best path for survival. But younger warriors and traditionalists saw things differently. They viewed American influence as corrosive, threatening not only their lands but their identity, their culture, and their independence. This faction called themselves the Red Sticks, named after the red war clubs they carried. Inspired by Tecumseh and the spiritual message of Tenskwatawa in the Northwest, they believed the time had come to resist American expansion with force. They called for a return to traditional ways and for unity against the American presence spreading deeper into the Southeast. Tension between the two Creek factions grew steadily, and by 1813, the division exploded into violence. What began as a civil conflict among the Creeks would soon draw the United States into a complex and ferocious war. When Red Stick warriors attacked settlers and Creek allies who supported American cooperation, frontier communities cried out for protection. Panic spread across Alabama and Georgia as rumors circulated of impending raids. The United States, already engaged in a massive fight along the Canadian border, now faced a second war to contain in the South. The turning point came in August of 1813, when Red Stick warriors launched a devastating assault on Fort Mims, a small frontier settlement. Hundreds of settlers, African Americans, and pro-American Creeks were killed. The massacre shocked the nation. Newspapers printed sensational accounts of the attack, stirring anger and fear across the South and West. For many Americans, Fort Mims became a symbol of the savage intensity of the conflict and the necessity of a decisive response. The message was clear. The United States could not ignore the war in the South. It had to confront the Red Sticks head-on. Into this storm stepped a man whose name would soon echo throughout American history: Andrew Jackson. A militia general from Tennessee, Jackson was known for his fierce temper, unyielding determination, and deep belief in American destiny. Despite suffering from chronic illness and lacking formal military training, Jackson embodied the frontier spirit, relentless and unwavering. When the call for volunteers went out, Jackson mobilized his men and marched south with a single goal: crush the Red Stick resistance. The campaign that followed was grueling. Jackson's forces, composed of Tennessee militia, frontier volunteers, and allied Cherokee and Lower Creek warriors, moved through rugged terrain where supply lines stretched thin and weather turned hostile. Hunger, exhaustion, and disease stalked the army as much as enemy fire. Yet Jackson drove his men forward with relentless resolve. He saw the war not only as a military necessity, but as a personal mission, one tied to his identity as a frontiersman, a leader, and a protector of American settlement. Throughout the winter of 1813 and into the spring of 1814, Jackson launched a series of attacks on Red Stick strongholds. His forces won critical victories at Tallushatchee and Talladega, battles that demonstrated both the determination of the Red Stick fighters and the uncompromising strategy Jackson brought to the campaign. Each victory pushed the Red Sticks farther toward the center of their power, but the resistance remained fierce. The war was not simply a geopolitical conflict, it was a cultural and spiritual struggle for survival. Everything came to a head at Horseshoe Bend in March of 1814. Here, on a bend in the Tallapoosa River, the Red Sticks built a fortified encampment known as Tohopeka. Their defenses were strong, their warriors determined, and their cause infused with a sense of destiny. They believed this would be the moment they could halt American encroachment, defend their traditions, and protect their homeland. Jackson prepared for the assault with grim determination. He positioned artillery on high ground, sent allied Cherokee warriors to block escape routes, and waited for the moment to strike. When the attack began, it was sudden and overwhelming. Cannon fire ripped through the barricade. Jackson's men surged forward, engaging in brutal, close-quarter combat. Cherokee and Lower Creek allies captured the rear of the stronghold and cut off retreat. Surrounded and outnumbered, the Red Stick warriors fought with extraordinary courage, refusing to surrender even as defeat became inevitable. By the end of the battle, more than 800 Red Stick warriors lay dead. It was one of the most devastating defeats ever suffered by a native army on American soil. Horseshoe Bend shattered the Red Stick movement, broke the back of Creek resistance, and effectively ended the Creek War. For Andrew Jackson, it marked the moment he became a national figure, military hero whose name soon reached Washington and the front pages of newspapers across the country. For the Creek Nation, it marked a tragedy of irreversible consequences. In the aftermath, Jackson forced Creek leaders, both allies and enemies, to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson. Despite the fact that many Creeks had fought alongside him, the treaty demanded an enormous surrender of land, more than 20 million acres across present-day Alabama and Georgia. It was one of the largest land cessions in American history. This moment reshaped the map of the Southeast and opened vast new territories to American settlers, cotton plantations, and slave expansion. But the cost was immense. The Creek War destroyed communities, fractured alliances, and left deep scars that would never fully heal. It marked the beginning of a transformation that would sweep across the entire region, one in which native nations found themselves increasingly pushed from their ancestral lands as American expansion accelerated. As 1814 unfolded, the war in the South wound down, but the War of 1812 was far from over. With the Creek resistance crushed, Andrew Jackson's focus would soon shift toward a new threat: the British forces gathering in the Gulf of Mexico. The conflict that had begun on the frontier was about to jump onto the world stage, bringing Jackson, the South, and the nation to one of the most dramatic showdowns in American history. The British Strike Back, 1814 by 1814. The War of 1812 had entered a dark and uncertain chapter. For nearly 2 years, the United States had struggled against the world's greatest empire, fighting on distant frontiers across the Great Lakes and along the Atlantic coast. But everything was about to change. In the spring of 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte, Britain's most powerful rival, fell in Europe. With the war in Europe effectively over, Britain suddenly had thousands of seasoned troops, battle-hardened officers, and a mighty navy available for deployment. And now, with renewed strength, Britain turned its full attention toward the United States. What followed was a series of dramatic strikes that pushed America to the brink of collapse. The British arrived with a clear strategy: apply overwhelming pressure along the coast, crush American morale, and force the young republic into a humiliating peace. Their sights were set on three key targets: the northern border, the Chesapeake region, and the Gulf Coast. Each area held strategic and symbolic value. But the heart of their plan focused on the very seat of American government, the capital city of Washington. The Chesapeake Bay became the stage for Britain's most aggressive operations. British naval commanders understood that the bay offered easy access to major cities, rich farmland, and the political core of the nation. With their powerful fleet, they could blockade ports, burn towns, and strike deep into American territory with little warning. The region became a corridor of terror as British raiding parties swept through coastal communities, destroying military supplies and sending civilians fleeing inland. In August 1814, British forces advanced on Washington with a confidence born of military superiority. American defenders, outnumbered and disorganized, struggled to mount an effective resistance. The Battle of Bladensburg, fought just outside the capital, became one of the most humiliating defeats in U.S. military history. Exhausted militia units broke ranks under British assault, leaving the road to Washington virtually unprotected. President James Madison and government officials fled the city as British troops marched in. What happened next became one of the defining moments of the war and one of the darkest. British soldiers entered Washington and set fire to the city's public buildings. The Capitol burned. The Treasury and State Department burned. The Great Library of Congress went up in flames, its books turned to ash. And in the most symbolic act of all, the British torched the president's house later, known as the White House, its white walls glowing red against the night sky. The flames lit the horizon for miles, a burning reminder that the United States was vulnerable, fragile, and far from secure. The destruction stunned the nation. Newspapers struggled to capture the shock, describing scenes of smoke-filled streets, collapsing roofs, and charred ruins. Citizens across the country felt an unfamiliar sensation: fear that the Republic's survival was not guaranteed. Yet even in this moment of despair, the country found unshakable symbols of resilience. First Lady Dolly Madison became a national hero after saving the famous portrait of George Washington from the flames, refusing to let it fall into enemy hands. And in the midst of the destruction, sudden and violent thunderstorms struck the city, what many called a hurricane dousing the flames and forcing British troops to withdraw sooner than planned. Some Americans viewed it as divine intervention, a sign that the nation would endure. But the British were not done. Their next target was Baltimore, a major port city and a hub of privateering, a place where American ships had seized. British vessels throughout the war, determined to break American resistance once and for all. British forces launched a combined naval and land assault on the city. What happened in Baltimore would become one of the most iconic moments in American history. On September 13, 1814, British warships opened fire on Fort McHenry, bombarding it through the night with rockets and exploding shells. The sky glowed with red arcs of fire, and the thunder of cannon echoed across the bay. For 25 relentless hours, the British attempted to force the fort's surrender. Inside, American soldiers endured the assault, determined not to yield. As the bombardment raged, a young lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched from a British ship where he was being held temporarily. He could see the fort only when the rockets burst in the air, revealing flashes of the American flag defiantly flying above the ramparts. When dawn finally broke, the smoke cleared just enough for Key to see the flag still standing, the Star-Spangled Banner, battered but unfallen. The British assault had failed. Baltimore had held. Inspired by the sight, he began writing the words that would become the national anthem of the United States. It was a moment of triumph born out of fire and fear, proof that the spirit of the nation could endure even in its darkest hour. The failure to take Baltimore marked a turning point. Though Britain remained powerful, its campaign had lost momentum. The war had dragged on longer than expected, draining resources and political patience. Meanwhile, American victories on other fronts, including key successes in the North, began to shift the balance. The British government, eager to stabilize Europe after years of conflict, saw little benefit in prolonging the war in North America. By late 1814, peace negotiations were underway in Ghent, Belgium. But even as diplomats debated terms, the people of the United States still lived under the shadow of invasion. Cities fortified their defenses, militia units trained with renewed urgency, and communities braced for the next British strike. Although the flames of Washington had cooled, the memory of that night lingered, an unspoken reminder that the nation had survived only through determination and luck. Yet in the face of defeat and destruction, the people found unity. Americans rallied behind their flag, their cities, and the idea that their young republic was worth defending. The British strikes of 1814 had pushed the nation to its limits, but they had also awakened a deep and powerful sense of identity. The United States had faced its greatest test, and, though wounded, it remained unbroken. The year 1814 revealed the brutal truth of war and the fragile heart of a rising nation. It showed how quickly triumph could become tragedy, how vulnerable the government could be, and how resilient the people were when everything seemed lost. The British had struck with overwhelming force, but the fire they ignited had only strengthened American resolve. The war was not over. And the most stunning chapter was still to come. A final clash that would transform one general into a national icon and give the nation a victory it would never forget. The war ends with a miracle, 1814 to 1815. As 1814 drew to a close, the United States stood exhausted. The war had ravaged its coasts, burned its capital, strained its finances, and exposed every weakness of a young republic still trying to prove itself on the world stage. Yet, despite the destruction and the humiliations, the nation had not broken. American pride, shaken but alive, held firm. But across the Atlantic, a very different calculation was unfolding. For Britain, the war in North America had shifted from a strategic opportunity to a costly distraction. With Europe in turmoil after Napoleon's defeat, the British government urgently needed stability, not another endless conflict. Diplomats from both nations gathered in the city of Ghent in modern-day Belgium to negotiate a peace treaty. The negotiations were slow, cautious, and filled with tension. Britain arrived with confidence, expecting territorial concessions and favorable terms. They wanted control of the Great Lakes, a buffer native state in the Northwest, and influence over American expansion. But as European events grew more complicated, British demands softened. Meanwhile, American negotiators led by John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Albert Gallatin refused to surrender an inch of American soil. As the talks dragged on, news from the war front filtered in, shaping the tone of the negotiations. American victories at Lake Champlain and Plattsburgh in September 1814 stunned Britain. Their northern invasion failed, and their armies retreated back into Canada. The defeat undermined Britain's bargaining position and convinced them that a prolonged war was not worth the cost. Eventually, both sides reached an agreement. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. It restored relations to the status quo before the war. No land changed hands. No claims were settled permanently. But most importantly, the war was over. Yet the United States did not know it. In an era before telegraphs, news traveled only as fast as ships could sail slowly and unpredictably across the winter Atlantic. While diplomats celebrated peace in Europe, armies in North America prepared for one last, decisive confrontation. The British, unaware the treaty had been signed, launched a massive assault on the port city of New Orleans. Their goal was clear: capture the city, control the Mississippi River, and strike a final blow that could reshuffle the peace terms once word reached Washington. Into this unfolding storm stepped General Andrew Jackson. Fresh from his victories in the Creek War, Jackson took command of New Orleans' defenses with urgency and intensity. He immediately sensed the magnitude of the challenge before him. The British were sending some of the best soldiers in the world, battle-tested veterans from the Napoleonic Wars. Jackson's own forces were a patchwork: militia from Tennessee and Kentucky, New Orleans Creoles, free black soldiers who volunteered to defend the city, native allies, local volunteers, and even the pirate Jean Lafette and his men. It was a coalition as unlikely as it was determined. Jackson understood that New Orleans was the key to the entire Mississippi Valley. If the British won, they would control the lifeline of the western frontier. The United States would lose not just a city, but the gateway to its most important river system. Jackson threw himself into preparing the defense. He fortified positions along the Rodriguez Canal, created earthworks from mud, timber, and cotton bales, and rallied his diverse forces with fiery determination. His presence electrified the city. When the British Army arrived in late December, they were confident. They outnumbered the Americans and possessed more professional troops. Their commanders believed the assault would be swift and decisive. But they underestimated Jackson, and they underestimated the fierce determination of the people defending their homes. The Battle of New Orleans began on January 8, 1815, in a thick morning fog that blanketed the battlefield. As the mist lifted, British soldiers advanced in tight formation across open fields, directly toward Jackson's fortified line. The Americans waited, silent and steady. Then the order came. A thunderous wall of musket and artillery fire erupted from the American positions. The British advance collapsed almost instantly. Officers fell in the opening volleys. Entire units broke formation under the devastating fire. Yet the British continued to charge, wave after wave, determined to break through. But the American line held. Backwoods riflemen unleashed deadly, accurate shots. Cannons tore through British ranks. Every attempt to breach the defenses met the same fate: overwhelming resistance. Within hours, the battlefield was covered with British casualties. More than 2,000 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. American losses were astonishingly low, fewer than 100. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. The triumph transformed Andrew Jackson into a national hero overnight. Newspapers across the country celebrated the victory, calling it a miracle. Citizens rejoiced in the streets. The stunning success at New Orleans seemed to prove that the United States could stand against any empire, no matter how powerful. The war had begun with humiliation, but it ended with a victory so dramatic that it overshadowed many of the earlier failures. Only after the celebrations began did news arrive that the Treaty of Ghent had been signed weeks earlier. Technically, the battle changed nothing about the treaty. It did not alter the borders or the terms, but symbolically, it meant everything. It shaped the way Americans remembered the war. Instead of recalling the burned capital, the lost battles, or the hardships, people remembered the triumph at New Orleans. The war became seen not as a struggle for survival, but as a second war for independence, proof that the United States could defend its sovereignty, its honor, and its people. As 1815 unfolded, the nation entered a period of renewed hope and unity. The war that had threatened to tear America apart now seemed to have strengthened it. Pride swelled in the hearts of citizens who believed they had defended their young republic against overwhelming odds. Andrew Jackson's name rose toward legend. The flag he had seen over Fort McHenry became a symbol of endurance, and the United States emerged from the conflict with a new sense of identities, stronger, more confident, and more united than ever before. The War of 1812 had ended not with conquest or surrender, but with a miracle of timing, courage, and resilience. And though it passed into history as a complicated, contradictory conflict, its final moments created a story that Americans would carry forward for generations, a story of defiance, unity, and the belief that even in the darkest moments, the nation could rise again. A new American identity, 1815 to 1816. How? The War of 1812 ended not with a clear victor on paper, but with something far more powerful for the United States, a renewed sense of pride and purpose. As 1815 began, the country emerged from the shadows of war with a confidence it had never fully known before. The British had burned its capital, blockaded its ports, and challenged its sovereignty, yet the nation endured. The victory at New Orleans, the resilience of its people, and the survival of the Republic created a wave of unity that swept across the land. For the first time since independence, Americans began to feel not just like citizens of individual states, but like members of a single nation with a shared destiny. The end of the war released a surge of energy throughout the country. In cities, bells rang and crowds celebrated deep into the night. Newspapers printed patriotic poems, heroic stories, and bold predictions about America's future. Many believed the nation had passed through a second war for independence, proving that it could stand against the greatest military power on earth. The feeling was intoxicating. A new generation, growing up after the Revolution, now saw the United States not as an experiment, but as a permanent presence, rising force with the strength to shape its own fate. The war had disrupted trade so profoundly that Americans had been forced to develop their own industries. Factories, once rare, now appeared across New England and the Mid-Atlantic. Textile mills along the rivers spun cotton into cloth. Iron foundries produced tools and machinery. And entrepreneurs, once dependent on British goods, discovered that the future of American prosperity rested not in imports but in domestic production. What had been born out of necessity now became a national ambition to build an economic system strong enough to stand independent of European powers. With peace restored, attention shifted to internal growth. Roads, canals, and turnpikes projects once stalled by war became urgent priorities. Travelers who once endured muddy tracks and unreliable paths now demanded improved routes that could connect distant regions of the country. The idea of linking the East Coast with the western frontier through trade routes gained momentum. The young nation recognized that its strength depended on connection, communication, and mobility. Every mile of new road represented a step closer to binding a vast and diverse country together. At the center of this transformation stood a new political era. James Madison, nearing the end of his presidency, had steered the nation through war with quiet determination. His leadership helped preserve the Union. But the country now looked ahead to someone who could guide a period of growth and unity. That figure was James Monroe, Revolutionary War veteran, former diplomat and statesman with deep experience in foreign affairs. Monroe's calm temperament and steady hand appealed to a country weary of conflict. When he ran for president in 1816, he faced almost no serious opposition. Monroe's election marked the beginning of what later became known as the era of good feelings, a period characterized by reduced political division and rising national unity. The bitter rivalry between Federalists and Democratic Republicans faded. The Federalist Party, damaged by its opposition to the war, began to dissolve. For the first time in American history, one political party dominated nearly every aspect of government. The absence of bitter conflict allowed leaders to focus not on partisan battles, but on building the nation's future. Yet beneath this hopeful atmosphere, challenges remained. Slavery continued to expand in the South, driven by the booming cotton economy. Western settlement pushed deeper into native lands, generating new tensions and displacing indigenous nations at an accelerating pace. The economic changes that fueled industrial growth also produced inequality and uncertainty. But for the moment, the country focused on its sense of triumph and possibility. Americans believed they stood at the beginning of something great, a chance to define their identity, strengthen their institutions, and shape their destiny as a continental power. Culturally, the nation began forging its own voice. American artists painted sweeping landscapes of forests, rivers, and mountains that revealed the grandeur of the land. Writers explored themes of freedom, democracy, and frontier life. Schools and academies expanded, reflecting the belief that a strong nation required educated citizens. Even fashion, architecture, and daily customs started to shift away from European tradition toward something distinctly American. The people were no longer content to imitate the old world. They wanted to create something entirely new. The return of peace also brought a wave of optimism to the expanding frontier. Veterans of the war sought new land and fresh beginnings in the West. Families loaded wagons and headed into territories like Indiana, Illinois, and Mississippi, eager to claim farms, start businesses, and build towns. The frontier represented opportunity, challenge, and the promise of a new life. It captured the imagination of Americans who dreamed of shaping the vast continent that stretched before them. This movement, westward slow at first, but gaining momentum, would eventually reshape the political and cultural landscape of the entire nation. On the diplomatic stage, the United States also gained newfound respect. European powers, once dismissive of the young republic, now viewed America with a degree of caution and recognition. The U.S. had survived conflict with Britain twice. It had defended its territory, protected its honor, and emerged with its institutions intact. Diplomats in Europe took notice. America's ability to endure war and maintain stability suggested that the Republic was not merely a temporary experiment, but a rising force in global affairs. Still, the transition from war to peace was not without tension. Returning soldiers struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. The government faced enormous debts from the conflict. Trade took time to recover. Farmers confronted shifting markets and changing economic conditions. But, despite these obstacles, the general mood of the country remained hopeful. The nation believed it had earned a place among the community of enduring nations, and that belief fueled its determination to build, expand, and unify. By late 1816, the contours of a new American identity had taken shape. It was an identity forged in war, but defined by peace, strengthened by adversity, yet driven by hope. Americans felt connected by shared sacrifice and united by a desire to secure their future. The war had tested their values, their resolve, and their sense of belonging. The peace offered them a chance to define who they wanted to be. And so, as the nation stepped into a new era under President Monroe, the United States carried with it the memory of fire, struggle, and triumph. From the ashes of Washington to the victory at New Orleans, from the hardships of the frontier to the optimism of new industry, Americans discovered that their national character was rooted not in perfection, but in resilience. They had emerged from the war with a clearer understanding of themselves, their potential, and their dreams. The story of 1815 and 1816 was not merely the end of a conflict, was the beginning of a new American identity. A nation once uncertain of its place in the world now stood ready to shape its destiny, confident that it could endure trials, overcome doubts, and rise stronger than before. The United States had survived its greatest test yet, and in doing so, it found the unity and ambition that would define its next generation.